Hi, I'm Gabrielle Lyon, Executive Director of Illinois Humanities. Illinois Humanities is a nonprofit statewide organization that activates the humanities through public programs, grants, educational opportunities, and our goal is to foster reflection, spark conversation, and strengthen civic engagement. That's why we're together with you tonight. I really want to thank you for joining us for People, Places, and Power, Fulton County edition. It's the newest installment of our Country and City Common Ground in the Prairie State conversation series. So tonight is really the second of 3 programs we're doing, and they're designed to help us explore something really important: the relationship amongst population distribution, political power, and public resources. This set of relationships can be really fraught in Illinois. And one of the reasons we're excited about this program is because we think it's a chance to have us get to know our disparate neighbors and maybe better understand the forces at work that both keep us apart and maybe could be bringing us even closer together. On this very rainy day, I'm here at the courthouse in Lewiston, Illinois. I'm in the heart of Fulton County. Tonight's program is part of the Democracy and Informed Citizen Initiative, and I really want to thank the Federation of State Humanities Councils, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the Grand Victoria Foundation, our very own Illinois Arts Council Agency, and especially the National Endowment for the Humanities for their support, because the creativity and insights that this program are going to be able to bring you tonight, it's because they've supported it. This content is mostly pre-recorded, but the event's live. So if you want to comment, you want to ask questions, go ahead and do that in the chat. Before we really begin with tonight's program, I want to share something that we've been thinking a lot about as we've been developing the People, Places, and Power series. Tonight's program is really going to be focused on the most recent history of this area, mostly on the 1960s through the present. Fulton County here in Western Illinois was established as a county in 1823, but this area has been inhabited with thriving culture for more than 2,000 years. The Havana Hopewell people occupied what's now known as the Ogden Fetty site 2,000 years ago, and other indigenous people, the Kickapoo, the Meskwaki, the Peoria, the Potawatomi, have all lived here as well. And it's really important to acknowledge their contributions to this place. And because we're talking about the issues we're talking about, I really want to make sure to point out that political power has been denied to them, and it's still used against them, first by European American settlers and often in the state's more recent institutions. The number of stories and kinds of people that have lived here are remarkable. During World War II, thousands of members of the Army Service Forces trained at southwestern Fulton County's Camp Ellis. It was actually one of the largest military installations in the country at the time. But the focus of tonight's program is going to ground us mostly in the 1960s and 70s. Our wonderful statewide engagement manager, Matt Meacham, will introduce us to the Forgottonia movement in just a moment. But first, let's hear from trumpeter and composer John Cooper, singer Joseph Henry, and members of the Post 6 Big Band of Macomb as they paid tribute in song to the movement's founder, Governor Gamm.
If you're walking down the street and we meet on the sidewalk, a reason for small talk, just remember I'm not a king, no brand or respecter or royalty scepter. I will greet you with a smile and we'll have conversation about our new nation. Please remember one little thing, they really do call me the governor. I'm self-anointed to be self-appointed. I don't want to run a long campaign. I'm in the mansion residing in fandom to listen to local folks complain. So if you see me hat and tails as I try to get money, it really is funny. Just recall this one little thing. They really do call me the governor.
Hello, I'm Matt Meacham, Program Manager for Statewide Engagement with Illinois Humanities. The concerns that prompted Neal Gamm and his compatriots to initiate the Forgottonia movement in Western Illinois involved the relationship between population distribution and the allocation of political power and public resources. Issues arising from that complex relationship have affected our country and our state throughout their histories. Such issues continue to elicit strong opinions and sometimes intense emotions among Americans and Illinoisans as the 2020 election approaches. Think of the ongoing debate over the future of the Electoral College, for example, or the perennial question of how to balance power fairly between Chicago and other regions of Illinois. This evening we'll discuss how people, places, and power intersect from the vantage point of Fulton County and the surrounding area. We're about to hear from Joe Brewer, a history teacher at Cuba High School, who directs the school's Forgottonia project. He'll tell us the story of Forgottonia and its legacy. Afterwards, some recent alumni of the Forgottonia project will explain how they've used that story as a starting point for exploring issues currently confronting rural America.
The name Forgottonia evokes different feelings across the region. To many residents, it awakens memories of a tongue-in-cheek secessionist movement that set out to create America's 51st state in 1972. It was a 16-county region throughout western Illinois, aptly named the Republic of Forgottonia. The idea was initiated by McDonough County resident Jack Horn and Macomb Chamber of Commerce board member John Armstrong. They recruited friend Neal Gamm, a Vietnam War veteran and theater student at Western Illinois University, to portray the role of governor of Forgottonia. Forgottonia creatively expressed feelings of neglect towards government officials who they felt ignored the region for far too long. Among the issues they raised, a lack of investment in higher education, a mass exodus of people and industries from the region, and of course, most notably, the constant defeat of bills seeking to build an expressway through the area. The plan to address these issues was pretty interesting. Forgottonia would secede from the Union, declare war, then surrender before the war ever happened. Finally, they would apply for foreign aid in order to bring in those funds so desperately needed. Gamm and friends even created a state flag, a simple white flag which symbolized their intention to surrender. They determined their capital would be located in the tiny town of Fandon, Illinois. In widely circulated photos, Gamm could be seen in his famous governor's outfit in front of deteriorating bridges, gravel roads, and battered barns. To their surprise, the movement received widespread coverage, even garnering mention in the New York Times. Gamm was emboldened and began leading parades of media down the streets of the tiny town of Fandon. Supporters sent in money, billboards were erected across various roads in the region, and Gamm and friends received endless requests for interviews and other appearances. To many locals, however, this was more than just a stunt. The Republic of Forgottonia might have begun as a joke, but it raised issues that were nothing to laugh about. Although Gamm himself was no expert, it was obvious to him that the residents of the region truly felt forgotten. In an interview with the McDonough Times in 2011, Gamm said, "People were frustrated. They needed someone to speak for them, and they thought I was it. In a way, I was. At least I got their opinions out there. People just didn't have a voice." Unfortunately, the stunt began to unravel. Forgottonia ultimately never received the help they sought and eventually abandoned its independence movement. Although some claim the Forgottonia movement was nothing more than a joke, one could argue that it did accomplish what it set out to do. Transportation eventually came to the area with the return of the Amtrak train, and the gradual improvement of the highway system. To another group of residents, however, the name Forgottonia has over time come to reflect a more affectionate sentiment about the area, something far less grim than a secessionist movement. Locals have restored the name to be more of a reference to the rich culture, the wildlife, and terrain found only throughout this 16-county region. Additional features that set this area apart include its extensive history, iconic imagery, and distinguished institutions of learning. Perhaps the recently opened Forgottonia Brewery best demonstrates the growing fondness many residents have come to associate with the name Forgottonia. Yet, to a third and final group of natives in western Illinois, the name Forgottonia means nothing at all. It's simply a story that somehow escaped their knowledge of local history. As a history teacher, I find that most of my students in Cuba High School are categorized in this last group of folks that just simply never heard of the Forgottonia story. Located in the center of rural Fulton County, one of the 16 counties making up Forgottonia, my students and I at Cuba High School set out to explore how this Forgottonia movement resonates with a new generation today. This is where the Forgottonia Project was born. The Forgottonia Project seeks to examine the social problems that face rural America. Students begin by asking tough questions about some of the problems they see in their own communities. To help better understand how to address them, our high school students here in Cuba, Illinois, are recording their own podcast conversations with some impressive, informed experts. It's inspiring to see students tackle these issues head-on and engage with experts who don't typically have an opportunity to communicate with a rural high school audience. Put simply, if we are serious about addressing this new generation of issues facing Forgottonia, then we must take seriously our efforts to invest in the youth who inherit these problems. Who knows, maybe there is a young person today growing up in one of these forgotten places who will be the next to initiate their own Forgottonia movement.
Our tagline is examining the social issues facing rural America today. And it's all about context, recognizing the context that my students are in. They are in a world that is even so different from mine. When I graduated high school, there was no fear. There was nothing in the pulse of Illinois young people that they were going to leave the state like this. But you come to rural Forgottonia, and you look at some of the figures, and we learned this by talking with, in one of our projects, the Illinois Institute of Rural Affairs, a real concern about young people in rural areas, leaving, feeling pressured to leave. So we want to examine those social issues.
My favorite podcast is probably the one that we did on Forgottonia Brewery here in Macomb, because it's about the small business trying to build up everything, and it was just a cool experience. And now I get to see the business itself start really taking off. So that's probably my favorite one.
Back in the early 1900s and even middle 1900s, about how Sundown Towns came to be. I found out that was quite interesting to me, about how many towns that we currently still visit today, and a lot of people still live in or go to, were sundown towns and were incredibly harmful to people of color after hours. So somebody of color, primarily Black, wasn't allowed after a certain hour after the day. So say someone who was Black wasn't allowed after hours in Cuba after 6 p.m. Now that's just a example, but that's a good example of a sundown town.
One thing that really resonated with me was that Caterpillar's HQ actually left in Peoria, and it did leave us a lot of people jobless and not having an income. Well, I've always worked since I was young, 14. So to me, I've always had a steady job, so it didn't really affect me. But thinking about all these people, we don't really have anywhere else to go when we lose, big company jobs like that, because we are more heavily manufactured, and our technology really puts an impact on that, because they can make product faster with less people. So then, where are we supposed to go if we don't have these manufacturing companies? there can only be so many people working on a farm, and there's only so much land. And for our small community, that's just so many jobs that it's hard to make an economic comeback when you lose that amount of money, not only hurting small businesses, but if the money's leaving, then, so is all these jobs.
And if we're going to resolve some of these issues and also get young people to stay, we got to give that space for young people to ask these potentially even dangerous questions, right? That are so much a part of this Forgottonia culture that we've come to love.
Our thanks to the Cuba High School Forgottonia Project. Be sure to check out the podcasts and other thought-provoking content on the Forgottonia Project website. One of the motivations behind the Forgottonia movement was a perception that Western Illinois wasn't receiving its fair share of public works, especially transportation infrastructure, in return for its tax contributions. More than 30 years later, in 2018, the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University Carbondale published a study of that very issue: how state taxation and state government expenditures are distributed geographically among different regions of Illinois. One of the authors of that report, political scientist John Jackson, will explain its findings to us. He'll then be joined in conversation by Laura Kent Donahue of Quincy, who represented much of Western Illinois in the state Senate in the 1980s and 90s, John Froling, editor of the Fulton Democrat, a newspaper covering Fulton County, and Giselle Ham, director of the Mapping the Future of Your Community program, offered by the Illinois Institute for Rural Affairs at Western Illinois University in Macomb.
Where is the state revenue raised in the first place, and then where it is spent? Starting with Cook County, which of course includes Chicago, their ratio is 0.90. In other words, they got back 90 cents for every dollar they sent to Springfield. The collar counties are next in our calculation. They are the biggest donors by far. They got back only 53 cents for every $1. Where I live in the South, and where Matt apparently grew up, Chester, Illinois, is a part of the South, and the ratio there is $2.81. We are the biggest winners of all, $2.81. However, the second biggest and second place is the central region, which includes the area that you're most interested in right now. They got back 1.87. And the southwest region, which includes the Metro East area, got back $1.42. The northern region is the lowest, but not quite 1.0. The northern region got back $1.24. So they are almost a quarter above the break-even point. Downstate's total ratio is 1.69. You might be able to tell by my accent, which is still there. I grew up in Arkansas, went to school in Arkansas, then moved to Texas and moved to Tennessee, where I went to grad school. So when I got to Southern Illinois, frankly, I felt pretty comfortable with the culture, the political culture. I understood Southern Illinois sort of intrinsically because of that background. But even with that background, I was surprised when I first got here by how many both politicians and people in my part of the state complained, I thought, rather much about Northern Illinois, especially Northeastern Illinois, and most notably Chicago. I wasn't really quite used to that. And I heard often that we'd be better off without them, and we'd be prosperous without Chicago. Knowing something about state revenue and teaching state and local government for many years, I suspected that really was probably not grounded in fact. Just recently, it's busted out all over again with this so-called Illinois separation movement, or the New Illinois movement. Two counties in central and southern Illinois, their county board put a referendum on the March primary about seceding, well, actually kicking Chicago out near the end of the paper. We say it is quite clear that downstate taxes are not being disproportionately siphoned off and spent in the city of Chicago. John Foster and I think that these kinds of debates ought to have some grounding in reality, some grounding in the facts, and we think these are important facts.
Back in the early 80s, I know that a lot of us in the legislature were wanting to know how much money we were sending to Springfield and what we were getting back. But I know Western Illinois and my area was sending more than, or receiving more than we were sending. And that was something we didn't want to know. But my point would be, if we go back to your myth, Matt, about Forgottonia, that started in the late 60s, early 70s. And when my mother was elected to the Illinois House of Representatives in 1972, she ran on the fact of the need for highways. That was the kind of the nuts and bolts of Forgottonia. And if you picture Western Illinois or Illinois, and you see the kind of the bulge, that area had absolutely no highways, no 4-lane highways. And I can remember she came from the Chamber of Commerce arena, and when she went, and it was also the time when legislation was single. It wasn't a part of some omnibus bill that everybody got a highway. You know, you had to sell your highway to the rest of the state. You had to get Chicago legislators voting for Western Illinois. And I can remember she passed out a ruler, and it had Quincy, you can't get there from here. There was a time when I stood on the Senate floor and I said that I represent one of the largest districts by area in Illinois, and I have less than 4 miles of 4-lane highway, and it's not all together. And that was the issue. You either had highways and you could attract business, or if you didn't have the business, you couldn't get the highways. We did succeed. Our highways, the Central Illinois Expressway was vital. The Chicago-Kansas City Expressway was vital. They're working seriously on 67, Corridor 67. But a point that probably needs to be made when you relate to Chicago, I know in the process of building the Central Illinois Expressway, it cost us $4 million per mile. Of course, this is back in the 80s, but it was $4 million per mile to build that highway. In the Chicago area, it's $40 million per mile to build.
Well, just to give you all a little bit of background information, what I do is I pull together a group of diverse community members in a rural community and help them come up with a vision and goals for the community. So usually working with 60 to 80 people. So bring them together, take them through a series of planning sessions. And through that, actually, we do one exercise and look at the assets and challenges the community has or is facing. And it's interesting, when we do the challenges piece, almost always, Illinois politics, Chicago politicians come up as a challenge. And so that's an issue. And I do know that misunderstanding that, you know, we receive fewer tax revenues for our taxes. I know that's a misperception out there, but there's so much more with that issue, and that really in rural, I feel rural folks really believe in living within their means. And so one of the biggest issues really is they see our Democrat-controlled state General Assembly, the fact that it seems to be, all about tax and spend, they really have issues with that. We haven't had a balanced budget for so many years. And so I think that's one of the big frustrations. I hear more about that than I really do the school funding at this point. So it's kind of that bigger piece, and also just the general mistrust towards the government and all the government regulations. I know one of the biggest issues we're facing right now in our rural communities is childcare. There's such a shortage of childcare. And one of the biggest issues that comes out in our process is the fact there's so many regulations in the state around childcare, and providers are quitting because they can't handle all the regulations. It's too cumbersome, and they're not starting because of all the regulations. And so that's a big issue. I know the minimum wage increase has been a big issue on our already struggling businesses. Many of the business owners aren't getting minimum wage themselves. And so how are you going to pay, the higher minimum wage and make it, because they're already struggling. The Chicago teacher salaries and pensions, that's oftentimes in the media, and I think that kind of helps fuel the fire around, the taxes going to the schools and downstate versus Chicago. I see it more as a kind of, it's a Chicago issue, but I also see it as kind of a more, rather than rural versus urban, it's more wealthy and thriving versus poor and declining communities.
On the redistribution of tax dollars, and I think you kind of alluded to this, Ms. Donahue, I'm not sure how the formula works as I can understand it as a per capita, but when you look at the region, the geographical region, Chicago takes up a little section of the state. When you take the whole rest of the state and look at the distribution of funds for sewer and water and economic development programs to keep old people out of nursing homes, etc., it seems to kind of skew these ratios if you look at the mileage that's involved. But I think there's some ingrained notions that I see with like the mayor of Canton and his attitudes towards Chicago, the county board chairman. They go, well, you know how it is. It's Chicago. There's a lot of laws that are written just for municipalities with more than 1 million people, and there's not too many like that other than Chicago. So it's just kind of an ingrained thing. I think the Forgottonia movement lingers in the backs of people's minds. I think around 1990 or so, the last coal mine around Middle Grove closed. But I think in a related sense, these power plant closings. And I don't know what the deal is with ComEd up in Chicago and all that stuff, but there's been, I believe, 4 or 5 power plants owned by some company based in Texas. And that's a big hit to the local taxing bodies. And there were really good paying jobs there too. Canton had a power plant, Duck Creek. I was told they made like $70,000 a year, the people that work there, the rank and file. So yeah, coal's been a big deal, but it's pretty much as an industry itself, it's kind of phased out. There's more interest in rails to trails than mining these days.
A kid in Chester or in Carbondale or in a rural area outside either of those is likely to have the same kinds of problems and limitations that a kid on the south side or east or west side of Chicago has in terms of getting an adequate education and adequate funding for K through 12, for example. And I think we've made some progress in that area recently, but compared to all the other states I've lived in, Illinois harps on the divisions and the geographical and regional competitions and the feelings of not being sort of a part of a whole. We don't have the same sense of Illinois, we're all in this together, and we don't have politicians who really sell that. And we've got to find people who work on those things that are common to all of us and emphasize those. I think we got that in the capital improvements bill. We've been talking about highways. A lot of Republicans voted for the capital improvement bill that got through $44 billion, or I believe was what it was. And rural areas are benefiting. We're benefiting in this end of the state as a result of that capital. And it's certainly not just highways, but there was a doubling of the gas tax to get that. And a fair number of our Republican legislators from down here voted for it because it was one of those things that's going to benefit all of Illinois. And of course, mass transit in Chicago got a cut of that.
One issue I see that I think we've got bipartisan support on is really broadband investment. That's such a big one. We have such a major, one of the biggest issues I deal with is kind of youth out migration, where the young people are going to universities, not seeing a reason to come back to Hillsborough, Illinois. But one way to kind of entice and attract is to have high-speed broadband available, have good middle-income housing, not just low-income housing available, but good middle-income housing to really attract, the telecommuters. A lot of our millennials, can work for a company in Chicago and live in downstate Illinois, no problem if they have broadband. But that is a big challenge. And I think we're seeing that even now more with COVID, where a lot of our young students, are struggling to keep up because they don't have good high-speed internet access. So that's one issue, and I think Governor Pritzker has gotten around the whole broadband, which is great. So
what's good for Macomb isn't necessarily good for Chicago. What's good for Naperville doesn't really work in Chester. And when you have the legislature, it's hard to resolve the specifics. One doesn't fit us all. And I don't know how that's an issue in Illinois. It will continue to be an issue. I don't know how we resolve that. It's like prevailing wage with government, the Capitol bill and whatever. If it's a highway, the universities, it all has to be prevailing wage. And it doesn't cost as much to do those things in downstate sometimes. There was a program that the Farm Bureau has put together, and they did it in my time, and I think they still continue it, if the legislators do it. Not all of them do. But they, like Adams County would adopt a Chicago legislator, come down, ride my tractor, see my schools, drive from Canton to Macomb and see the distance, and come down and learn my district, and I should go up there to learn their district. I mean, we need to know each other and forget some of our dislikes and hate that's going on, and just think out Illinois is what we're here about, and do the best we can.
Tonight, we're asking people to think about critical and fundamental questions, many of which are about fairness. What's the most fair way to have voters represented? What's the fairest way to distribute Illinois' tax burden and our public expenditures? How should our state actually balance needs, priorities, values of urban and suburban Illinoisans with those of rural residents? The People, Places, and Power episodes of Country in the City, Common Ground in the Prairie State, they're really designed to highlight the connections between democracy, the humanities, and the role of all of us as engaged citizens. One of the things I really appreciate about the stories we're exploring in and around Fulton County is the way that they really illustrate that these things are complex, they're messy, and they're also deeply personal. We're going to open the second half of our program with Tiffany White from the Dirksen Congressional Center in Pekin. Everett Dirksen was from neighboring Tazewell County. Now, he was an adept politician. He really understood how to work the mechanics of government, and he was known for working both sides of the aisle. Dirksen was a famous orator. He was a frequent guest on national television, and he was also a critically important champion and crusader for the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 1968. We're going to learn a great deal about Dirksen in terms of something very specific, in terms of the themes of tonight's program and urban-rural dynamics. In short, Dirksen called on people to wrestle with this basic underlying issue: whether representation in our government should be based entirely on population or on a combination of population and geography. In other words, of people and place.
Excellent point. You know, the main argument for population-based representation, what's sometimes called one person, one vote, is simply that every voter should have as much influence as every other voter, and that legislative districts should be designed so that each legislator represents the same number of people. One complication with that, though, is that because urban and suburban areas are more populated than rural areas, a system that's based only on population can result in situations in which governmental decision-making reflects urban and suburban perspectives more than rural perspectives. And as we've already gleaned from tonight's program, what rural residents need and expect from government sometimes differs from what urban residents need and expect. This question of whether only people or both people and place should matter is at the heart of many national and state level controversies today, including debates about the Electoral College and about how to balance Chicago's influence within Illinois state government with that of less populous communities. Senator Dirksen had a keen appreciation for this issue in Illinois and across the country. Let's hear more from Tiffany White of the Dirksen Congressional Center.
Today, I'll be presenting to you on the apportionment debate of the 1960s, in which Senator Dirksen was very much involved. Our story here begins in 1964, when the Supreme Court announced in Reynolds v. Sims and its 5 companion cases that all state legislative apportionment must be conducted according to the standard of one man, one vote. Being challenged all over the nation were the practices of maintaining traditional legislative district boundaries, regardless of their population or any other considerations for representation. For Everett Dirksen, the Republican from Illinois, and the Senate's minority leader, the court's reapportionment decisions expressly violated the rights of states to determine for themselves how best to constitute their legislatures. As a matter of philosophy and principle, Dirksen favored what was known as the federal plan, which provides that one branch of a state's legislature be based upon population and another on geography. But by a 6-3 decision, the court declared each house in a state legislature must be made up of districts that are equal in population. Nothing else at all would do. In part, the Supreme Court was responding to the overall movement of the nation's population from the country to the city, a movement underway since the turn of the 20th century. By 1960, there was not a single legislative body in a single state in which there was not at least a 2-to-1 population disparity between the most and least heavily populated districts. For example, the disparity in the Georgia Senate was 9-to-1. The disparity in the Rhode Island Senate was 141-to-1, and the disparity in the Connecticut House was 242-to-1. As a result, malapportionment had benefited rural areas in state legislative chambers. As people abandoned the farms and countryside, legislators apportioned there on the basis of geography represented fewer and fewer citizens. The result, of course, is that those who remained in those rural areas possessed an overweighted influence in their unique interests in government. Reynolds v. Sims virtually assured population-based apportionment in every state within 3 years. Chief Justice Earl Warren later termed the reapportionment decision the most important decided by the Supreme Court during his 16-year tenure. In his sweeping majority opinion, he wrote, "Legislators represent people, not trees or acres. Legislators are elected by voters, not farms, cities, or economic interests. To the extent that a citizen's right to vote is debased, he is that much less a citizen. Diluting the weight of votes because of place of residence impairs basic constitutional rights under the 14th Amendment, just as much as invidious discriminations based upon race or economic status." The Warren Court's decision precipitated a massive backlash. More than 100 members of Congress introduced a variety of bills to overturn or modify the court's rulings. Senator Dirksen quickly emerged to lead those opposed to the court's decision. Deeply suspicious of federal government overreach, whether from Congress, the president, or the courts, Dirksen instinctually placed his faith in the wisdom of the people. Dirksen explained that what is really at issue here is not whether so-called equal population districts are or are not better. Instead, the issue is simply whether the people can continue to make the choice. The people created our form of government, he insisted, and only they should have the right and the power to change it. Dirksen then introduced Senate Joint Resolution 2 on January 7, 1969, and so began the race to overturn the court's one-man, one-vote decision. The resolution, informally named the Dirksen Amendment, took the form of a constitutional amendment that said, in essence, if a state legislature is dissatisfied with its apportionment under the standard of one man, one vote, as imposed by the Supreme Court, then it may devise a new apportionment plan. Further, if there is a bicameral legislature, one of the two chambers must adhere to the one man, one vote principle, but the other may be apportioned on factors other than population. Dirksen told his colleagues he had always believed that the people are the fountainhead of governmental power under our form of government, that they have the right to choose whether or not they wish one house of the legislature of their state to be apportioned based upon factors other than population. In his testimony before the Senate Committee on the Judiciary, Dirksen said, "We are confronted with a basic issue of government here." Turning to a set of notes in Dirksen's papers further enhances our understanding of the depth of Dirksen's conviction on the matter. These notes served as an outline for remarks he delivered on the Senate floor as his colleagues debated the fate of this legislation. "What we propose," Dirksen wrote, "was to go back to the people." In all of this, however, Dirksen faced an uphill climb indeed, for a 2/3 vote was necessary in both the Senate and in the House, and the votes did not appear to be in sight with the heavy Democratic majorities of both chambers. Dirksen commanded only 32 Republicans of the 100-member Senate. Over the next 3 years, though, Dirksen and his supporters tried 3 times to pass the Dirksen Amendment. At each stage of the legislative process, Dirksen made concessions to opponents in order to clear the 2/3 hurdle of a constitutional amendment. Opponents of the amendment stressed, for example, that it could be used to perpetuate discrimination against African American voters by overweighting white-dominated geographical or political subdivisions. 3 times, Dirksen marshaled more than 50 votes in the Senate, but 3 times did he fail to pull together the necessary 2/3 majority. And so, with the legislative remedy to the Supreme Court's decision beyond reach, Dirksen turned to a little-known and never-used clause in Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution that allows the states themselves to collectively petition Congress to call a national constitutional convention. Sidestepping the question of whether such an assembly could be limited to just a single issue, a question which, by the way, nobody really knew the answer to, Dirksen maintained publicly that no one should fear the wisdom of the American people as the ultimate arbiters of the democratic process. In the spring of 1969, Iowa became the 33rd state to petition for a convention, just 1 short of the necessary number. But on September 7th, 1969, Everett Dirksen dies at age 73 from post-surgical complications. For all practical purposes, that ended the campaign for a constitutional convention, and with it, the challenge to Reynolds versus Sims. Academic author Douglas Smith argues in his definitive study of the reapportionment controversy that from June 1964 until Dirksen's death, an intense battle was waged in the United States over the legitimacy of the Supreme Court and its interpretation of the rights of individual voters in a representative democracy. The outcome was not inevitable. And although Dirksen failed to win what he called the most important battle that Americans have faced on the home front in 100 years, his efforts took place within the age-old debate, unresolved yet today, about the fundamental nature of federalism in our country. Where should the locus of power reside? In the people, and exercised through the states or in the federal government? As Dirksen might have put it in the 1960s, why doesn't Washington trust the people in the states? But today, the debate about federalism might be put more provocatively as, why don't the people trust Washington? In 2020, Dirksen likely would answer the question this way. The people in the states no longer trust Washington, not simply because Washington has been doing a less than satisfactory job. Witness, for example, the paralyzing gridlock so common in our modern politics, which would have confounded Senator Dirksen immensely. More fundamentally, the threat to the proper balance in federalism stems from Washington's appetite, and this includes the court, to assume a vast array of regulatory and redistributive powers that were never its to assume, not, that is, if one approaches the Constitution as Everett Dirksen did.
Well, our next segment is a profile of the famous late 19th and early 20th century poet Edgar Lee Masters. We're going to hear about him from Illinois Humanities' very own Rhodes Scholar, John Halwas, who's a great literary historian. You know, Matt, I heard a lot about the Spoon River Anthology, and when I visited Lewiston, I got a chance to actually visit the Oak Hill Cemetery that inspired Masters. So that was a lot of fun. But it did make me realize I don't know very much about the poet. You know, what do you think? What do you think we should really know and understand about him?
Well, Masters loved and idealized rural mid-America. Being a Jeffersonian, he believed that rural places, the agrarian economy, and social traditions should have at least as much influence in American life and government as urban places, industrial economies, and social innovations. Over the course of his life, Masters became disappointed that the political power of rural communities seemed to be declining. And his loyalty to his own cultural community kind of hardened into resentment and prejudice against others, especially urban communities and people of different ethnicities. So later in life, he wrote poetry that was bitter and sometimes even racist, even though his earlier work reflects a strong sense of empathy and community spirit. And as John Halwas will tell us, there seems to be a lesson there for us today.
Well, let's turn it over to John.
To explore the issue of contentious interaction among localities in Illinois, we might reflect on the experience of the most noted author from the Fulton County area, Edgar Lee Masters. His poetic village of Spoon River was based on two locations that were associated with his youth. One was Menard County, south of here, where Lincoln's New Salem is located, and very rural county. And the other, of course, is Fulton. In the 19th century, those two counties were on opposite sides of a cultural divide, because the southern half of Illinois was, after all, filled with people with a southern background. In Menard County, the people who dominated by far were from Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky, including the Masters family. His grandparents remained there when the family moved north from Menard County to Lewiston in 1880, when Masters was about 12 years old. And Lewiston had some New England people there, so it was a bit different. They were Yankees, as they were called on the frontier, but as a result of that, the Masters family had a difficult time fitting in initially, and Edgar Lee Masters was impacted by that. And he idealized that branch of his family back in Menard County, and in fact he spent several summers when he was a young man back in that county living with his grandparents. So, as I mentioned in my book, Spoon River Anthology, an annotated edition. That cultural group back in Menard County maintained intense loyalty to a narrow circle of people, family, kinsfolk, and others just like themselves. And they advocated individual rights, they idolized Andrew Jackson, and they supported the Democratic Party. Lewiston was different in many ways, and later, when Masters moved to Chicago, that industrialized metropolis was extremely different. So he later in his career developed the notion that the rural people he idealized and had lived for a long time in Menard County had a kind of idyllic agrarian democracy, a culture that had originated with Thomas Jefferson and had been realized finally on the Jacksonian frontier. But unfortunately, in his view, the coming of the Civil War and industrial development in America had changed things, had allowed materialistic and repressive forces to dominate. Or as he later put it in a 1933 book titled The Tale of Chicago, there are two strains of blood in America, one that stayed close to the soil and developed character and originality, and the other that struggled for riches in the cities and became parasitical. So due to his experience, Masters viewed himself eventually as a prophet of Americanism, who was calling the nation back to that earlier kind of agrarian vision. And he continued to celebrate his own southern-bred rural people. For example, in a 1942 poem called New Salem Hill, he praises those early people of Menard County who were joyous, brave, and free because they lived in a sylvan democracy and they were purged of old world blood. And another poem from 1935 was titled, Give Us Back Our Country, as if some other groups had taken away his better America. Obviously, the later view that Masters developed was prejudiced, based on his experience with and concern for his own originating place and his ethnic background. So it is a very relevant lesson for our own time today, as we see Americans who don't effectively extend themselves beyond the cultural place where they live or people of their own ethnic background. In view of this, it's ironic, of course, that earlier in his career, Masters had taken us inside the struggle of a variety of people, including women, the disadvantaged, and the poor, in his American classic Spoon River Anthology. The experience of Edgar Lee Masters also reminds us of the significance of meaningful belonging, or having a sense of place, which promotes personal satisfaction with our daily living, as I point out in another book of mine called Western Illinois Heritage, for example, where I stress the importance of developing a sense of heritage in this region that extends across cultural and social boundaries. So, we must continue to promote belonging or sense of place and allow our personal connections to extend us beyond the place where we live and beyond our own ethnic background.
Our gratitude to John Halwas for that important message. The culture of rural Western Illinois continues to inspire the work of artists, including Colin Healy, composer of Forgottonia the Musical. Colin Healy now joins us, along with Kaylin Beekman, one of the Forgottonia Project alumni whom we met earlier, who's now studying journalism at Western Illinois University.
If you could you tell us a little bit about yourself and what your connection is to the Forgottonia area?
I'm Colin Healy. I am a composer based in St. Louis. I'm also a theater educator and writer and artistic director of a local theater company called Fly North Theatricals. I have close to no connection personally with the Forgottonia area. My family's from Marion, Illinois, which is not in the Forgottonia area technically, but it did sort of, start my fascination with the Midwest. I grew up in Florida, outside of Miami, outside of like up near Fort Lauderdale. When I was about 20, so like 10 years ago now, I was watching a really dorky show called How the States Got Their Shapes on the History Channel 2. And they did a segment in the Illinois episode about Forgottonia. And I thought the movement was, from Neal's perspective, sort of silly and genius and weird and lovely, and stood for all the right things, whether or not they intended to or not. And I was like, wow, that's really cool. And that sounds like a good time of a musical. And I just kind of put it on the shelf for later. And then around 2016, politics got quite farcical. And also at that same time, I was patroned by East Central College in Union, Missouri. This is after I moved to St. Louis to write a new musical for them to produce for the first time. And I was like, boy, do I have the perfect story for this region. Because they're another rural region that feels sort of forgotten in the shadow of St. Louis, because they're just outside of like the metro area. And it was a first draft, and it did pretty well out there. So yeah, to answer your question, I don't really have a connection with the Forgottonia area, but I am fascinated by it.
So besides the History Channel interaction, was there any other sort of inspiration, or what were your first impressions of the area?
So I did, this is kind of a two-part answer. I did travel to the area as part of sort of the journalistic side of doing my research about it. I went to Colchester, which is where the show takes place. I thought it was quaint. I thought it was cool. I grew up in a city, my whole life. So it's definitely different from what I'm used to. As far as the inspirations are concerned, I would file this musical under the umbrella of like coming of age story. It tells two stories kind of side by side, two siblings, one on either side. One is her story, one is his story. His story is Jack Horn, who was Neal's friend and sort of the other side of the movement. And it takes a little bit more of a truthful, like historical approach, covers some beats in the Forgottonia story, and some kind of lesser known stuff about Neal's life and whatever I could find about Jack. The other side of the story is completely fictional. And between them is their father, Pappy Horn, which is a real person, but I sort of superimposed, my own upbringing on that. And so, yeah, it's a hodgepodge of history and therapy. It's a story about home and a story about family, and when you leave home and it's not really what you thought it was going to be, like the world ain't as wide as you thought it was, like how do you cope with that, and like coming back home and all that stuff, it's it gets more to the heart of that, and it has more of a human element to it than it's wrapped in this politics and wrapped in the sort of turmoil of the time with Vietnam and Nixon and all that.
Thank you, Colin and Kaylin. We'll conclude our program with the finale of Forgottonia the musical, The Old Forgotten Land, performed by Fly North Theatricals of St. Louis. Once again, we thank the Federation of State Humanities Councils, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the Grand Victoria Foundation, the Illinois Arts Council Agency, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. We're also grateful to our local partners, the Dirksen Congressional Center in Pekin, the Easley Pioneer Museum in Ipava, and the Western Illinois Museum in Macomb. We thank Videogenique of Peoria and Brian Schrage of Edwardsville for the production assistance. And of course, we thank you for joining us and participating in this conversation. For more about Illinois Humanities, visit us at www.ilhumanities.org and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Have a good evening.
If there was whiskey in the river, if the fields were really made of gold, if the trees would shimmer in the sunlight, maybe then our stories would be told. But then it would all be different, and that's not what God had planned. And so we make our home in this old forgotten land. If there was whiskey in the river, if the grass would wave hello, if your time here made you younger, maybe then some other folks would know. But then it would all be different, sure as the lines on our hands that come from when we built our home in this old forgotten land. 'Cause ain't nobody here gonna till the